My name is Bobby, 65 years old, a retired civil engineer from Austin, Texas. Nothing prepares you for the moment your only child dies. Michael was only 35 when that semi-truck crossed the center line. But even in my suffocating grief, I never expected what came next. Just 14 days after we buried my son, his wife Cassandra cornered me in the kitchen. "You have a week to move out," she said coldly. "This is my house now." I stood there, coffee mug suspended mid-air, unable to believe my ears. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're watching from, and hit subscribe if you've ever discovered that sometimes the people who should love you the most can become complete strangers overnight. Michael was everything to me after my wife Sarah passed away from breast cancer when he was just 15. Those years raising him alone forged a bond between us that I thought was unbreakable. We faced that grief together, father and son, against the world. And I watched him grow into a compassionate, intelligent young man who made me proud every single day. When Michael finished medical school and secured a position as an emergency physician at Austin Memorial, I couldn't have been prouder. He was following in his mother's footsteps, as she had been a dedicated nurse before her illness took her from us. Michael had her compassion and her eyes, and every time I looked at him, I saw pieces of her living on. 5 years ago, when Michael told me he was getting serious with Cassandra, I was genuinely happy for him. Then came their engagement, followed by discussions about where they would live. Housing prices in Austin had skyrocketed, and they were struggling to find something suitable within their budget, even with Michael's physician salary. "Dad," Michael said one evening as we sat on my porch, "Cassandra and I have been talking. What if we bought a place together, all three of us? Something with enough space for everyone, maybe even with a separate in-law suite for you." I was touched by the offer, though initially hesitant. "Son, you two are just starting your lives together. You don't need your old man hanging around." Michael shook his head. "It makes financial sense, Dad. You've been talking about downsizing from this big house since Mom died. If you sell and we combine resources, we could get something really nice that works for everyone." The idea made practical sense. My 3-bedroom house had become too large after Sarah died, full of empty spaces and echoing memories. I had substantial equity built up after 30 years of mortgage payments, and Michael was right that combining our resources would allow us to purchase something none of us could afford individually. After several family discussions, we agreed. I would sell my house and contribute 80% of the proceeds toward a new home large enough for all of us. Michael and Cassandra would take out a mortgage for the remaining portion. We found a beautiful 2-story house in a good neighborhood with a finished basement that could be converted into a comfortable apartment for me, complete with a separate entrance. It seemed perfect. The agreement was simple, at least verbally. The house would belong to all of us, with me having lifelong residency rights in my section. I would contribute to utilities and property taxes, but the bulk of my financial contribution would come up front from my home sale. After closing, I threw myself into renovating my space. As a civil engineer who had worked in construction management for decades, I had the skills to transform the basement into a comfortable 1-bedroom apartment. I installed new flooring, updated the bathroom, and even added a small kitchenette so I wouldn't always need to use the main kitchen upstairs. Michael often joined me on weekends, the two of us working side by side, just like when he was a teenager, and I taught him basic home maintenance skills. "You've outdone yourself, Dad," Michael said when we finished the renovations. "This place looks better than the main house now." I didn't stop with my own space. Over the next 2 years, I replaced the roof, updated the main kitchen, and built a beautiful deck in the backyard where we would gather for family barbecues. I poured not just my savings but my heart into making this house a home for all of us. Michael and I maintained our close relationship after the move. Every Sunday we watched football together, and at least once a month we went fishing at Lake Travis, just the two of us. During those quiet mornings on the lake, Michael would share his concerns about work, his hopes for starting a family with Cassandra, and occasionally his frustrations with his marriage. "Cassandra can be difficult sometimes," he confided during one such trip, casting his line into the still water. "She has very specific expectations about how things should be." "All marriages have adjustment periods," I reassured him, though privately I had my own concerns about their relationship. Michael traveled frequently for medical conferences, but no matter where he was in the country, he always called me every other day to check in. "Just making sure you haven't fallen and can't get up," he'd joke, though we both knew he was honoring a promise he'd made to his mother to always look after me. What I didn't know until much later was that Michael had quietly taken steps to protect me. When we purchased the house, he had insisted that my name be included on the deed alongside his, something he never mentioned to me. It was a decision that would prove far more important than either of us could have imagined at the time. "Dad," he said during our last fishing trip together just 3 weeks before the accident, "I want you to know that no matter what happens, you'll always have a home with us. I've made sure of it." I thought he was just being sentimental, never realizing he was sharing something crucial that would soon become my lifeline. Looking back, I wonder if he had a premonition, some subconscious awareness that his time was limited. Whatever his reasons, that act of foresight was the greatest gift my son could have given me, though I wouldn't understand why until after he was gone. I first met Cassandra at a hospital fundraiser where Michael was being honored for his work establishing a free clinic in an underserved neighborhood. She was striking with a perfectly styled dark hair and an elegant bearing that commanded attention. At 38, she was 3 years older than Michael, had a successful career in pharmaceutical sales, and had been divorced once before with no children. "Dad, this is Cassandra," Michael said, beaming with pride as he introduced us. "Cassandra, my father, Bobby." She offered a perfectly manicured hand and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Michael has told me so much about you. It's lovely to finally meet the man who raised such a wonderful doctor." From that first meeting, I sensed a guardedness in Cassandra, a careful distance she maintained despite her outward politeness. I initially dismissed my concerns, telling myself I was just being overprotective of my son. After all, Cassandra was accomplished, intelligent, and Michael clearly adored her. What right did I have to question his choice? Still, as their relationship progressed toward marriage, certain red flags became harder to ignore. Cassandra seemed to have expensive tastes that stretched even Michael's substantial income. The engagement ring she wore cost nearly 3 months of his salary, and their wedding was an elaborate affair at one of Austin's most exclusive venues. "Don't you think it's a bit much?" I cautiously asked Michael during wedding planning. "These costs add up quickly." "She deserves the best, Dad," Michael replied with a shrug, "and it makes her happy. That's what matters to me." After they married and we all moved into the new house, I made concerted efforts to build a relationship with my daughter-in-law. I learned which foods she preferred and would prepare special meals when Michael was working overnight shifts. I offered to help around the house and tried to engage her in conversation about her work and interests. Cassandra maintained a polite facade when Michael was present, but her demeanor changed noticeably when we were alone. Conversations became curt. My attempts at connection met with barely concealed impatience. I began to notice a pattern in how she treated me versus how she behaved around my son. "Bobby, would you mind not rearranging things in the main kitchen?" she said one morning, her tone making it clear this wasn't really a request. "I have a specific system, and it's disruptive when items aren't where I expect them to be." "Of course," I replied, though I had only been putting away dishes I'd washed. I didn't realize. As months passed, Cassandra began systematically redesigning the house, removing family photos that included me or Sarah, replacing furniture I had brought from my previous home with expensive new pieces, and creating what she called a more cohesive aesthetic. Each change erased another piece of our family history, transforming the home into something that reflected only her tastes and preferences. Michael was frequently caught between us, trying to maintain peace while balancing his demanding career. "Dad, could you maybe just try to adjust to how Cassandra likes things?" he would gently suggest after she complained about my presence in the main house during her book club meetings. "Son, I'm trying," I assured him, "but sometimes I feel like I'm walking on eggshells in my own home." Approximately a year after we all moved in together, I overheard a phone conversation that confirmed my worst suspicions about my daughter-in-law. I was returning from a walk when Cassandra's voice drifted through the open patio doors. She was speaking to someone, presumably a friend, unaware of my presence. "Living with Michael's father is absolutely exhausting," she complained. "He's constantly hovering, acting like this is still his house. I know the financial arrangement made sense, but honestly, I'm counting down until we can get this place to ourselves." Her friend must have asked a question because Cassandra laughed before responding. "Of course I'm nice when Michael's around. What choice do I have? But once we're more established, things will change. Michael will eventually see that having his father here isn't working." I quietly retreated, my heart heavy with the realization that my daughter-in-law viewed me as a temporary inconvenience to be tolerated rather than family to be embraced. Still, I kept what I'd heard to myself, not wanting to create conflict between Michael and his wife. My son was happy, or at least he seemed to be. and that was what mattered most to me. Over the next few years, I watched as Cassandra's spending habits placed increasing pressure on their finances. Despite her own solid income, there were always new designer clothes, expensive salon appointments, and lavish vacations she insisted they deserved. Michael never complained, but I saw the strain in his eyes when bills arrived, the quiet calculations he would do late at night at the kitchen table. "Everything okay with money, son?" I asked one such night, finding him surrounded by paperwork. He forced a smile. "Just the usual juggling act, Dad. Nothing to worry about." But there was plenty to worry about, as I would later discover. Cassandra had accumulated substantial credit card debt that Michael was helping to pay off, all while maintaining the lifestyle she felt entitled to. My son, always generous to a fault, never confronted her about these spending habits, instead picking up extra hospital shifts to cover their expenses. Despite my growing concerns, I continued trying to maintain harmony in our shared home. I minimized my presence in common areas when Cassandra was entertaining friends, kept my opinions about her spending to myself, and supported Michael in whatever ways I could. If this uncomfortable arrangement was the price for remaining close to my son, it was one I was willing to pay. What I didn't realize then was that this uneasy peace was merely the calm before a storm that would sweep away everything I thought I understood about my place in my son's life and home. The call came at 3:17 in the afternoon on a Tuesday in October. I remember checking my watch as the phone rang, thinking it might be the plumber I'd scheduled to fix a leaking faucet in my bathroom. Instead, it was a voice I didn't recognize, a hospital administrator speaking with carefully measured words. "Mr. Preston, this is Marjorie Wilson from Central Texas Medical Center. I'm calling about your son, Dr. Michael Preston. There's been an accident." The world narrowed to that single point of contact, that voice delivering words no parent should ever hear. Michael had been driving home from an overnight shift when a semi-truck crossed the center line on a rain-slicked highway. The collision was catastrophic, leaving my son with injuries too severe to survive. "He's in critical condition," the administrator explained. "The doctors are doing everything possible, but you should come immediately." I don't remember the drive to the hospital. One moment I was standing in my kitchen, the phone slipping from my nerveless fingers, and the next, I was running through emergency room doors demanding to be taken to my son. They brought me to a trauma room where Michael lay surrounded by his colleagues, people who were normally his teammates now fighting desperately to save his life. The attending physician, a man about my age with compassionate eyes, pulled me aside as monitors beeped ominously. "Mr. Preston, I'm Dr. Ramsey. I worked with your son for years. We're doing everything humanly possible, but I need to prepare you. The injuries are catastrophic. If there's anyone else who should be here—" "His wife," I managed to say. "Cassandra. I've tried calling, but she's not answering." While a nurse continued attempting to reach Cassandra, I was allowed to approach Michael's bedside. My strong, vibrant son was unrecognizable, his body broken beyond repair, sustained only by machines. I took his hand, mindful of the IV lines, and leaned close to his ear. "I'm here, son," I whispered, tears falling freely. "Dad's right here with you." Whether he could hear me, I'll never know. 30 minutes later, despite every intervention modern medicine could offer, my only child was pronounced dead. I stood frozen as the machines were silenced, as the medical team offered condolences, as someone guided me to a private room to wait for Cassandra. She arrived nearly 2 hours later, her eyes wide but curiously dry. "There was a sales meeting," she explained without prompting. "My phone was off." While I had collapsed into grief, Cassandra immediately began handling practicalities with an efficiency that seemed almost mechanical. She spoke with hospital administrators about releasing Michael's body, contacted a funeral home, and spent most of the time in the hallway making phone calls. "We need to discuss arrangements," she said as we finally left the hospital together. Michael and I never really talked about what he would want. "He would want to be buried beside his mother," I said with certainty. "We purchased adjoining plots after she passed." Cassandra frowned slightly. "That's not very convenient. Most of our friends live closer to the city." The following days passed in a blur of arrangements and paperwork. I moved through them like a man underwater, every sound muffled, every sensation distant. Cassandra took control of the funeral preparations, consulting me only perfunctorily. The service she arranged was elegant but impersonal, with colleagues and her friends occupying most of the seats. My input was minimal. my grief overwhelming. During the funeral, I noticed something odd about Cassandra's behavior. While she played the role of grieving widow when speaking with guests accepting condolences with appropriate solemnity, her demeanor changed during private moments. Several times I observed her checking her phone, even smiling slightly at messages received. After the service, a reception was held at our home. I retreated to my basement apartment, unable to bear the sound of subdued conversation and the sight of people consuming catered food while discussing my son's life in past tense. Late that evening, after the last guests had departed, Cassandra knocked on my door. "Bobby?" she said, her voice carefully modulated. "I know this is difficult for both of us. I think we should discuss the future once you've had some time to process everything." I nodded numbly, not yet understanding what she really meant. The days following Michael's funeral were the darkest of my life. I barely ate, slept in fragments, and spent hours staring at photographs of my son. The house above me continued its rhythms, with Cassandra returning to work almost immediately. Our paths rarely crossed, which suited my desire for isolation. About a week after the funeral, I was startled by unusual sounds from upstairs, laughter, and multiple voices at an hour when Cassandra typically worked. Curiosity drew me upstairs, where I discovered Cassandra entertaining 3 people I'd never seen before. They fell silent when I appeared in the doorway. "Bobby," Cassandra said, a hint of irritation in her voice. "These are colleagues from the regional office. We're discussing some work matters." "I see," I replied, noting glasses of wine and a casual atmosphere that seemed inappropriate for a business meeting, particularly in a house still draped in grief. I didn't mean to interrupt. Over the next few days, similar gatherings occurred with increasing frequency. Different visitors came and went, none of whom had attended Michael's funeral. Their conversations, which fell silent whenever I appeared, held an undercurrent of excitement rather than condolence. Then came the evening when, unable to sleep, I went to the kitchen for tea and discovered Cassandra at the dining table, laptop open before her. She quickly closed it when she noticed my presence, but not before I glimpsed what appeared to be luxury real estate listings. "It's late," she said, gathering her things. "You should try to get some rest." The following morning, I received an automated email from our joint bank where Michael and I had maintained a shared account for household expenses. The notification indicated unusual activity, a large withdrawal that had triggered a security alert. When I logged in to investigate, I discovered multiple recent transfers moving money to an account I didn't recognize. Something was happening, something beyond the normal aftermath of loss. Still deep in grief, I struggled to make sense of these puzzling developments, not yet understanding that my world was about to shatter a second time. 2 weeks after we buried my son, Cassandra knocked on my door at precisely 8:30 in the morning. When I opened it, she stood there looking perfectly put together in business attire, her expression resolute. "Bobby," she said without preamble, "we need to talk about living arrangements." I invited her in, offering coffee, which she declined. We sat at my small dining table, the silence stretching uncomfortably between us. "This is difficult," she finally said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "But I think it's time we address the elephant in the room. With Michael gone, our arrangement no longer makes sense." "What arrangement?" I asked, genuinely confused. "This living situation," she gestured around her. "You living here. I need to move forward with my life, and having my father-in-law in the basement isn't conducive to that process." I stared at her, struggling to comprehend what she was implying. "Cassandra, this is my home too. I contributed the majority of the down payment." Her expression hardened. "That was a gift to Michael and me for our marriage. This has always been our house with you as a guest. Now that circumstances have changed, I need my space to grieve and rebuild." "A guest?" I repeated incredulously. "I put in 80% of the purchase price. We had an agreement." "Was there anything in writing?" she asked coolly. "Any legal document stating your ownership, because the mortgage is in my name and Michael's. Your contribution was exactly that, a contribution." My hands began to shake. Michael and I had an understanding. This was meant to be my home for the rest of my life. "Well, Michael isn't here anymore," she said, her voice suddenly sharp. "And I need to be practical. I'm not running a retirement home, Bobby." Then came the words that would replay in my mind for weeks afterward. "You have a week to move out. I think that's generous, considering the circumstances." I sat in stunned silence, unable to form a response. Cassandra continued speaking, outlining how I should handle my departure, suggesting senior living facilities I might consider, even offering to help me find a suitable apartment. Her voice washed over me in a tide of betrayal. "Why are you doing this?" I finally managed to ask. "Michael has only been gone 2 weeks." "Exactly," she replied. "And I need to start rebuilding my life. I can't do that with my husband's elderly father living downstairs. It's not what I signed up for." "Not what you signed up for?" Anger began to cut through my shock. "We bought this house together as a family. I've contributed to every bill, maintained the property, treated you like a daughter." Cassandra's laugh was bitter. "Let's not pretend we were ever really family, Bobby. We tolerated each other for Michael's sake. Now that he's gone, there's no reason to continue this charade." "The house," I began. "I put in most of the money." "Without a written agreement, your contribution was a gift," she interrupted. "Legally, this house belongs to me now as Michael's widow. I've already confirmed this with my attorney." I thought of the home I'd sold to buy this one, the decades of memories surrendered to create a new life with my son and his wife. Now, not only had I lost Michael, but I was about to lose everything else as well. "You can't just throw me out," I protested. "I have rights." "Actually, I can," Cassandra replied, standing up. "And if you make this difficult, I won't hesitate to get a court order. I'm trying to be reasonable, Bobby, but my patience has limits. 1 week, that's my final offer." After she left, I sat motionless at my table, trying to process what had just happened. Was she right? Did I have no legal claim to the house, despite my substantial financial contribution? The thought seemed impossible, yet the confidence in Cassandra's voice suggested she believed she stood on solid legal ground. Later that day, I checked our joint bank account again and discovered something that increased my suspicions. A large deposit had been made the day after Michael's funeral, labeled insurance payment. It appeared that Michael's life insurance policy had paid out, and the sum was substantial. Within days, most of that money had been transferred to a separate account. Cassandra's ultimatum now made more sense. With Michael's life insurance payout and full ownership of the house she stood to gain financially from his death. The thought made me physically ill. That evening, I heard unfamiliar male laughter from upstairs, followed by music and the clink of glasses. While I sat alone mourning my son, his widow appeared to be entertaining. The contrast was so stark, so painful, that I finally began to understand the true nature of the woman my son had married. I spent that night alternating between grief and growing anger. By morning, I'd reached a decision. I would not simply accept Cassandra's version of events. Before taking any action, I needed to understand my actual legal position. If I truly had no claim to the house, I would need to make arrangements quickly. But something told me that Michael would not have left me so vulnerable. With new purpose, I began searching through the files I'd kept from our home purchase, determined to discover the truth about my rights and options before confronting Cassandra again. The morning after Cassandra's ultimatum, I pulled out the file box where I kept important documents. My hands trembled slightly as I searched through papers related to the house purchase from 5 years earlier. Most of the closing documents were copies Michael had provided, and I hadn't scrutinized them carefully at the time, trusting my son to handle the details. Near the bottom of the stack, I found the property deed. My breath caught as I read the names listed as owners: Michael Preston, Cassandra Preston, and Robert "Bobby" Preston. There it was in black and white, legal proof that I was not merely a guest in this home, but a rightful owner. "You always were looking out for me, weren't you, son?" I whispered, touching Michael's name on the document. A bittersweet mixture of gratitude and grief washed over me. Even as a successful adult, my son had continued to protect his father, anticipating potential problems I hadn't foreseen. I immediately called James Hoffman, a lawyer who had been both my attorney and friend for over 20 years. He agreed to see me that afternoon. "Let me get this straight," James said after I explained the situation. "Your daughter-in-law is attempting to evict you from a home that you partly own just 2 weeks after your son's death." "That's about the size of it," I confirmed, pushing the deed across his desk. "Am I reading this correctly? Do I have legal ownership?" James examined the document carefully before nodding. "You absolutely do, Bobby. You're listed as a joint tenant with right of survivorship. In plain English, you and Cassandra now each own 50% of the property following Michael's passing." Relief flooded through me, followed quickly by anger at Cassandra's deception. She told me she consulted an attorney who confirmed the house was legally hers. Either she's lying about speaking to an attorney, or she found someone willing to give her the answer she wanted without seeing the actual deed, James replied. "Either way, she has no legal grounds to evict you, none whatsoever." Armed with this knowledge, I decided to investigate further before confronting Cassandra. Something about her behavior since Michael's death felt suspicious beyond simple grief or adjustment. Returning home, I carefully began monitoring the comings and goings from our house while appearing to comply with Cassandra's eviction timeline. I pretended to make calls to apartment complexes, even visited a few senior living facilities when I knew she was watching. All the while, I was building a clearer picture of what was really happening. 3 days after my meeting with James, I was working in my small garden behind the house when I overheard a conversation through an open window. Cassandra was speaking with a man whose voice I didn't recognize, their tones, intimate and familiar. "Once we sell this place, we'll have more than enough for the down payment on the lakefront property," she was saying. "The market's hot right now, we could list next month." "What about your father-in-law?" the male voice asked. Cassandra laughed. "He'll be gone by next week. Poor old man actually believes he has no choice. Once he's out, we can start staging the house." "And you're sure about the insurance money?" "Already transferred to my personal account. Michael never changed the beneficiary from our wedding. It's all perfectly legal." I froze, trowel in hand, as the full scope of Cassandra's betrayal became clear. She wasn't just trying to remove me from my home, she was already planning a new life with another man, funded by my son's death benefits and the proceeds from selling our house. That evening, I made a crucial discovery while searching through Michael's home office. In a folder labeled Family Documents, I found a letter addressed to me in my son's handwriting dated just 3 months earlier. "Dad," it began. "If you're reading this, something has happened to me. I hope you never need to see these papers. But working in emergency medicine has taught me to be prepared for the worst. The house deed has your name on it for a reason. I've never fully trusted Cassandra's intentions toward you, especially if something were to happen to me. There's also a separate life insurance policy with you as beneficiary details enclosed. I love you, Dad. Take care of yourself, Michael." Alongside the letter was documentation for a smaller life insurance policy, separate from his main one, with me listed as the sole beneficiary. My son had created a safety net for me, anticipating a betrayal I couldn't have imagined. With growing suspicion, I hired a private investigator recommended by James. Within days, he provided evidence that Cassandra had been involved in a relationship with a real estate developer named Thomas Brewer for at least 8 months before Michael's death. Photos showed them together at restaurants and hotels in neighboring cities where they wouldn't be recognized. Most damning was information about Cassandra's first marriage. Her previous husband had died unexpectedly as well, though from natural causes. Within months of his death, she had sold their home and relocated to Austin with a substantial insurance payout. As these revelations accumulated, my grief transformed into cold determination. Cassandra had underestimated me, assuming I was too broken by loss and too intimidated by her to stand my ground. She had no idea that Michael had protected me even from beyond the grave, or that I was slowly building a case that would shatter her plans. The final piece fell into place when, pretending to be out for the day, I secretly recorded Cassandra bringing Thomas into our home. Their conversation in the kitchen below my hiding place in the upstairs guest room left no room for doubt about their relationship or intentions. "Just 1 more week until the old man's gone," she said between kisses. "Then we can really start our life together." "Are you sure he doesn't suspect anything?" Thomas asked. "Bobby, please." Cassandra laughed. "He's been a shell since Michael died. Besides, what could he do? The house will sell for at least $800,000 in this market. Half of that plus the insurance gives us over $1 million to start fresh." "You're amazing," Thomas replied. "Most women would be devastated losing their husband." "Michael and I were already growing apart," Cassandra said dismissively. "He was working constantly, and when he wasn't, he was with his precious father. I was ready for something new even before the accident." Their callous discussion of my son, whose body was barely cold in his grave, filled me with a righteous anger I had never experienced before. In that moment, listening to them plan their future over the ruins of my family, I made my decision. Cassandra would not profit from my son's death, not if I could help it. With evidence in hand and a clear understanding of my legal position, I was ready to confront the woman who thought she could discard me like unwanted furniture, all while plotting to steal my home and my son's legacy. 6 days after Cassandra's ultimatum, with just 24 hours remaining before her generous deadline expired, I executed the plan I had carefully developed with James Hoffman's guidance. That morning I made a show of packing boxes and loading a few into my truck, making sure Cassandra noticed my apparent compliance with her eviction demands. "I should be out by tomorrow afternoon," I told her when she checked on my progress. "Just finalizing arrangements for temporary housing until I find something permanent." "That's good to hear," she replied, poorly concealing her satisfaction. "I think this is best for both of us, don't you? A clean break." I nodded meekly. "You're probably right. Too many memories here." As soon as she left for work, I contacted everyone involved in my countermove. By late afternoon, I received the text message I'd been waiting for. Cassandra had left her office early and appeared to be headed home with a stop at a local restaurant, where, according to my private investigator, she was meeting Thomas. I quickly made a final call to James, confirming everything was in place, then positioned myself in the living room with a cup of coffee waiting. At precisely 6:15, Cassandra's key turned in the lock. She entered with Thomas close behind her, both stopping short when they saw me sitting calmly in the main house rather than packing in my apartment. "Bobby," she said, clearly flustered, "I didn't expect you to be up here. This is Thomas, a work colleague who's helping me evaluate some home repairs." "Hello, Thomas," I replied pleasantly. "Or should I call you sweetheart like Cassandra does when she thinks no one is listening?" The color drained from both their faces. "I don't know what you think you're implying," Cassandra began, her voice rising defensively. "Let's not insult each other's intelligence," I interrupted, standing up slowly. "I know about your relationship. I know about your plans to sell this house. And most importantly, I know what the property deed actually says." Before she could respond, the doorbell rang. Cassandra froze, looking uncertain for the first time since this ordeal began. I moved to answer it, revealing James Hoffman standing on the porch alongside a woman who bore a striking resemblance to Michael, his older sister Amanda, who had flown in from Seattle at my request. "Please come in." I invited them, gesturing toward the increasingly crowded living room. "Cassandra, you remember Amanda, Michael's sister? And this is James Hoffman, my attorney." Cassandra's composure visibly crumbled. "What is this? Some kind of ambush?" "Not an ambush," I replied calmly. "Just a necessary correction of some misunderstandings." I retrieved a folder from the side table and withdrew several documents, laying them out one by one. "This is the property deed showing I am a joint owner of this house. This is documentation of my financial contribution, representing 80% of the original purchase price. This is a letter from Michael, explaining his concerns about your intentions. And these," I said, placing several photographs on the table, "are evidence of your relationship with Thomas during your marriage to my son." Cassandra stared at the documents, her face cycling through shock, anger, and finally calculation. "Whatever you think these prove, the fact remains that as Michael's widow, I have rights." "Absolutely," James interjected smoothly. "You have rights to exactly 50% of this property, no more. You cannot evict Bobby, sell the house without his consent, or make unilateral decisions about this property. Furthermore," Amanda added, her voice tight with barely controlled anger, "as executor of Michael's will, I'll be thoroughly investigating all financial transactions following my brother's death, including any insurance payouts or transfers from joint accounts." Thomas, who had been silently edging toward the door during this exchange, suddenly found his voice. "Cassandra, maybe we should discuss this another time. I didn't realize the situation was so complicated." "Don't leave on my account," I told him. "You should hear the options we're offering Cassandra. Option 1, she can buy out my share of the house at current market value plus interest on my original investment. Option 2, we sell the house and split the proceeds equally. Either way, I expect to be compensated for improvements I've made to the property over the past 5 years. Cassandra's face had transformed from shock to fury. "You sneaky old man. You were pretending to pack up and leave this whole time." "I learned from the best," I replied without humor. "You've been pretending to grieve my son while planning your future with another man." She shifted tactics instantly, her expression softening into something resembling contrition. "Bobby, this is all a misunderstanding. I've been under tremendous stress since Michael died. Maybe I spoke hastily about you moving out. Of course, this is your home too. We can work something out." "The time for that passed the moment you tried to throw me out of my own house 2 weeks after burying my son," I responded, my voice finally betraying the depth of my anger. "I don't trust you, Cassandra. I don't want to live under the same roof with you. What I want is my fair share of this property so I can move forward with my life just as you suggested." "But where will I go?" she asked, suddenly playing vulnerable. "This is my home." "That's not my concern," I said, echoing her earlier coldness. "You have options, which is more than you are willing to give me." Thomas had inched closer to the door during our exchange. "I should go," he muttered. "Yes, you should," Amanda snapped, "and understand that if you're involved in any attempt to hide or transfer assets that rightfully belong to my brother's estate, you'll be implicated legally as well." After Thomas beat a hasty retreat, James outlined the legal process moving forward. Cassandra would have 30 days to decide whether to buy out my share or agree to sell the house. Meanwhile, I would continue living in my apartment, and she would be legally prohibited from harassing me or interfering with my residence. "This isn't over," Cassandra hissed as James and Amanda prepared to leave. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." "On the contrary," I replied quietly, "I know exactly who I'm dealing with now, and so do you." After they departed, leaving Cassandra seething in the living room, I returned to my apartment and collapsed into my armchair, emotionally exhausted, but feeling something I hadn't experienced since Michael's death, a sense of control returning to my shattered life. My son had protected me with his foresight, making sure I wouldn't be vulnerable to exactly the scenario that had unfolded. Now, it was my turn to protect his legacy from the woman who had so quickly betrayed his memory. 6 months after confronting Cassandra, I stood on the deck of my new home watching gulls circle above the waters of Galveston Bay. The small 2-bedroom house wasn't fancy, but with its weathered wood exterior and panoramic water views, it represented everything I needed at this stage of life: peace, independence, and a fresh start. The legal battle with Cassandra had been mercifully brief once she realized her position was untenable. Faced with Amanda's thorough investigation of financial improprieties following Michael's death, Cassandra agreed to sell our Austin home and divide the proceeds according to our ownership percentages. She even returned a portion of the funds she had inappropriately transferred from joint accounts, though only after James threatened legal action. The house sold quickly in Austin's hot real estate market, fetching significantly more than our purchase price 5 years earlier. My share, combined with the separate life insurance policy Michael had established for me, provided enough to purchase this coastal property outright and establish a comfortable financial cushion for my remaining years. I learned through the grapevine that Cassandra's relationship with Thomas had dissolved shortly after our confrontation. Apparently, the real estate developer had been attracted to the prospect of Cassandra's windfall more than to Cassandra herself. When that windfall diminished and legal complications arose, his interest evaporated. Last I heard, she had relocated to Houston, hopefully to prey upon someone else's family. Standing on my deck with coffee in hand, I reflected on how differently things might have turned out had Michael not taken steps to protect me. Without my name on that deed, I likely would have been forced from my home with nothing but my Social Security and modest savings to sustain me. My son's foresight had been my salvation. The months following Michael's death had been the darkest of my life, the double blow of losing him and then facing betrayal from the woman who should have become family. There were nights I didn't think I would survive, the pain days when getting out of bed seemed an insurmountable challenge. Yet here I stood, rebuilding my life one careful step at a time. After settling into my new home, I'd made 2 significant decisions about Michael's legacy. First, I established the Michael Preston Memorial Scholarship for emergency medicine residents at his hospital, ensuring his commitment to healthcare would continue. Second, I began volunteering at a local grief support group, sharing my experience with others navigating similar losses. "The wound never fully heals," I told participants during my first meeting. "But we learn to carry our grief differently over time, incorporating it into our new reality rather than being consumed by it." Through these volunteer efforts, I gradually built a new community around me. Fellow group members became friends, inviting me to dinners and community events. Amanda and her family visited regularly from Seattle, our bond strengthened through our shared loss and the battle to protect Michael's legacy. I even reconnected with several former colleagues from my engineering days, one of whom lived just 20 minutes down the coast. Frank and his wife Carol began including me in their weekly dinner gatherings, introducing me to their circle of friends and gradually pulling me back into social life. About 3 months after moving to Galveston, I received an unexpected phone call from a mutual friend of Michael's and mine back in Austin. "Bobby, I thought you should know," Jim said hesitantly. "Cassandra's been having some troubles. That guy she was seeing left her high and dry, and she's apparently struggling financially. She's been telling people you took advantage of her grief to steal her rightful inheritance. I listened without comment, experiencing a momentary urge toward vindictive satisfaction that I quickly recognized as unhealthy. "Thanks for letting me know, Jim," I finally replied, "but Cassandra's problems are no longer my concern." "That's fair," he acknowledged. "I just thought you'd want to be aware of what she's saying about you." After hanging up, I walked down to the water's edge and watched waves lap against the shore, contemplating how easily I could have allowed bitterness to consume me. I could have pursued further legal action against Cassandra for defamation, contested every penny of the house proceeds, or worked actively to expose her infidelity to their social circle. Instead, I had chosen to walk away completely, leaving Cassandra and all she represented in the past. That decision hadn't been about forgiveness, a sentiment I wasn't yet capable of feeling toward her. Rather, it reflected my understanding that continued engagement with such toxicity would only prolong my suffering. The greatest tribute I could offer Michael was to live well to honor his memory by embodying the integrity and kindness he had valued. My son had protected me even after death, his foresight ensuring I wouldn't be left vulnerable. The least I could do was use that protection wisely, building something meaningful from the ruins of our shared tragedy. In the coastal community where I now lived, nobody knew me as poor Bobby who lost his son and got cheated by his daughter-in-law. Here I was simply Bobby, the retired engineer who volunteered at the community center, taught occasional woodworking classes at the senior center, and was building a small sailing dinghy in his garage. This fresh start didn't erase the past, nor did it diminish my love for Michael or the pain of losing him. But it provided space to carry those emotions without being defined solely by loss and betrayal. In turning my back on Cassandra's toxicity, I had turned toward a future still capable of containing meaning and even joy. As I watched the sun begin its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, I felt Michael's presence beside me, not as a ghost, but as a continuing influence in my life. The values I had instilled in him had come full circle when he protected me through his careful planning. Now, those same values guided my own choices as I navigated life without him. The path forward wasn't always clear, and some days the grief still knocked me sideways with unexpected force. But I was no longer drowning in it, no longer defining myself primarily as a bereaved father or a betrayed father-in-law. I was Bobby Preston, 65 years old, building a new life on my own terms, one day at a time. My phone chimed with a text message from Frank. "Fishing tomorrow morning, launch at 6 a.m. I typed a quick affirmative response, smiling at this simple evidence of continuing life. Michael would have approved. Have you ever had to protect yourself from someone who should have been family? What would you have done in my situation? Let me know in the comments below, and consider subscribing if this story resonated with you. Sometimes the hardest decisions we make are not between right and wrong, but between our own well-being and what others expect from us. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that it's never too late to stand up for yourself, even when you feel most vulnerable. Life can begin again at any age if we have the courage to turn away from toxicity and toward possibility.